On the night I turned 34, a box with my sister's name arrived at my door wrapped like a gift, but carrying the weight of a trap. And just as I reached for it, my husband's voice cut through the room sharp and urgent. "Stop! Can't you see it?" And in that instant, I knew my life in Cambridge would never be the same. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and this is the story of how a single birthday gift shattered everything I thought I knew about family. The candles flickered softly against the walls of our small apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I remember thinking how perfect the night felt. Ethan had cooked my favorite dinner-baked salmon with lemon and rosemary, and set the table with 2 wine glasses we usually saved for special occasions. It was my 34th birthday, and for once the air felt light, untouched by the shadows of my family's constant judgment. We laughed, shared a bottle of Pinot Noir, and for a moment it felt like the world outside didn't exist. Then the buzzer rang. I frowned, glancing at Ethan. We weren't expecting anyone. He raised an eyebrow and stood his chair, scraping softly across the hardwood floor. When he returned, he was carrying a large cardboard box wrapped in simple brown tape. My name was written across the front in thick black marker. There was a pause before Ethan spoke. "Lauren, it's from your sister, Samantha." The sound of her name tightened something inside my chest. We hadn't spoken properly in months, and when we did, it was usually filled with barbed words and silent disapproval. Still, a part of me felt that sting of hope, the small childish wish that maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch on my birthday. Ethan placed the box on the table. It was heavy, heavier than any gift should have been. My fingers itched to tear the tape away to search for some sign of affection hidden inside. But as I reached forward, Ethan's hand shot out, stopping me cold. "Wait." I blinked at him. "What?" He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "The shipping label, it doesn't look right. See this smudge, this uneven print? It's a fake." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand hovered above the box. Ethan's voice rose sharp and cutting through the quiet room. "Stop. Can't you see it?" I froze. The words rang louder than the city sounds outside, louder than the beat of my heart. The box sat there, suddenly monstrous, the brown tape like veins across its surface. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed. His voice was steady, calm, the way he always got when something felt dangerous. "Yes, this is Ethan Parker. We need someone here immediately." Suspicious package addressed to my wife. Minutes later, the flashing lights of a patrol car painted our windows blue and red. 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by a man in plain clothes who introduced himself as Detective Harris. They examined the box, their gloved hands moving carefully. One officer tilted it slightly, and the sound of shifting paper came from inside, not the clink of glass or the weight of something personal. "Do you have any idea why your sister would send you this?" Mrs. Parker, Detective Harris asked. My throat tightened. "No. I mean, we don't get along, but it's my birthday." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded toward the officer with the gloves. "Open it." The tape peeled away with a harsh rip. Inside were stacks of folders, manila envelopes stuffed with papers. One slid open, spilling across the table. Ethan reached instinctively to grab it, then pulled his hand back as though burned. My name was on the top of the document. Bold letters, signature lines, legal stamps. It was paperwork for a company I had never heard of, an import business registered under the name Lauren Parker. I stared, the words swimming in front of my eyes. "That's not mine. I never signed anything." Detective Harris picked up a page, scanning it quickly. "This company is tied to several flagged transactions. Jewelry shipments, large amounts of money moving offshore. All under your name." My knees nearly buckled. Ethan wrapped an arm around my shoulders, steadying me, but my whole body shook. This had to be a mistake. Why would she do this? Ethan whispered, more to himself than to me. The detective's eyes sharpened. "Do you think your sister could be involved?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Samantha's face flashed in my mind, the smug smile she wore whenever my parents praised her, the way she looked at me as if I were nothing. For a moment I wanted to scream, "Yes, she's capable of anything." But the words stuck in my throat, tangled with disbelief and a child's desperate wish that blood still meant something. The officers began collecting the papers, sealing them in evidence bags. Ethan stayed close, his warmth the only thing keeping me upright. Detective Harris gave me a card. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to make a statement. Do not touch anything else that comes from her." "Understand." I nodded numbly. The candles on the table had burned down to pools of wax. The salmon had gone cold. The night that had started with laughter now sat heavy with dread. When the door closed behind them and the flashing lights faded into the distance, I stood staring at the box, the hollow shell it had left behind on our dining table. "Happy birthday, Lauren," Ethan whispered bitterly. I didn't answer. My chest ached, not from fear alone, but from the sharp realization that my sister had just turned my life into a weapon, and she had aimed it straight at me. I sank into the chair, the sound of the city faint through the glass. Ethan paced the room, rubbing the back of his neck. My mind spiraled, questions spinning faster than I could catch them. Why me? Why now? What did she want? The wax on the candles cooled into brittle shapes. The night had been broken, and somewhere deep inside I knew this was only the beginning. The silence of the apartment pressed against me long after the officers had left, and with it came the memories I had tried to bury for years. The papers on the table seemed to whisper my name, and each whisper dragged me back into the past, to the moments when Samantha was the shining star, and I was little more than a shadow. It was Christmas Eve of 2010, a night still sharp in my mind. Snow had blanketed the streets of Providence, Rhode Island, the kind that glowed under street lamps and made everything look like a painting. Inside our family's dining room, the fire crackled, and the table was crowded with food my mother had prepared. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, her cranberry sauce that she never let anyone else touch. It should have been a warm memory, but instead, I remember how cold I felt sitting there between my parents and Samantha. Richard Carter. My father raised his glass and looked directly at Samantha. "To our brilliant girl," he said, smiling in the way he reserved only for her. She had just been accepted into Brown University, and the pride in his voice filled the room. My mother Diane reached over to squeeze Samantha's hand, her face glowing. Then his eyes flicked to me. "Lauren, you should learn from your sister. She knows how to plan her future." The words stung more than I let show. I was 19, still figuring out who I wanted to be, applying to smaller colleges, working part-time at a bookstore. But none of that seemed to matter when Samantha sat there smiling like she had already conquered the world. Samantha leaned back in her chair, her voice smooth. "Not everyone is cut out for success, Dad. Maybe Lauren will find something simple." My fork clattered against the plate. I remember the flush that burned up my neck, the way my mother's eyes narrowed, not at her, but at me. She said I was too sensitive, that I should be grateful for what I had, and so I stayed quiet, swallowing down the bitterness like dry bread. That night, while the snow piled higher against the windows, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, listening to the muffled laughter downstairs. My parents were still talking to Samantha, proud and glowing as though I didn't exist. I told myself it didn't matter, that I would find my own way. But the truth was, their words sank deep, carving a hollow place that never really healed. The sound of Ethan's voice pulled me back to the present. He was on the phone again, speaking quietly with someone from the station, confirming the appointment for tomorrow. His tone was steady, but when he hung up and looked at me, I could see the fear behind his eyes. "They said they'll need every document, every detail you can remember," he said. "Do you have any idea why your name is on that company?" I shook my head, though inside a chill ran down my spine. "Carter Imports LLC." The detective had said it with such certainty, as if it had always belonged to me. The name gnawed at me. Carter. My family's name, their legacy, their pride. I had never signed a paper for any company, but hearing it spoken aloud was enough to crack something open. My chest tightened as another memory surfaced. I was 21, fresh out of college, working my first job at an architectural firm in Boston. Samantha had visited me once, standing in my tiny studio apartment, glancing around at the mismatched furniture, like she was touring a charity project. She told me she was building something bigger, that one day she would own a company with our family's name on it. She laughed and said maybe I could work for her if I didn't screw it up. I hadn't thought about it in years. Now the company the detective mentioned bore the exact name she had once bragged about. Ethan pulled a chair closer, his hand covering mine. We'll figure this out. But you need to be honest with them tomorrow. Tell them everything. The shame I carried from my family's endless comparisons bubbled up again. I wanted to believe I was stronger now that their voices didn't define me. But staring at those folders, the evidence with my name, I felt the same smallness I had felt at 19. The knock at the door jolted us both. Ethan tensed, moving quickly, but it was only an officer returning to ask one last question. Mrs. Parker, do you have any knowledge of Carter Imports, LLC? My lips parted, but nothing came out at first. Then I forced the words. No, I have never heard of it. The officer studied me carefully, as if weighing the truth in my eyes, then wrote something down in his notebook. We'll need you to confirm that in your statement tomorrow. When the door closed again, I sank back, the old Christmas memories still sharp. My father's toast, my mother's narrowed eyes, Samantha's smirk, and now this company carrying the Carter name dragging me into a world I never chose. Ethan rubbed his temples, pacing the living room. You need to prepare Lauren. They'll press you about your family, about Samantha. I nodded, but my thoughts were already spiraling. I could feel the walls of the past closing in the shadows of that dining room years ago, pressing into the present moment. The detective's question echoed in my head, louder than the crackle of that long-ago fire. Do you have any knowledge of Carter Imports, LLC? The night stretched on, and I knew that by morning, the weight of my family's name would be heavier than ever. The morning light slid through the blinds, as if it wanted to expose everything I had tried to hide. I barely slept, and when the alarm rang, it felt like I had only closed my eyes for a moment. Ethan insisted on driving me to the office, but I shook my head. I needed to walk through those glass doors on my own. If I showed up clinging to his arm, it would only feed the whispers I already feared. The streets of Cambridge buzzed with the usual weekday rhythm, coffee cups in hand, buses hissing to stops, but my world felt slowed and heavy. When I stepped into the lobby of Whitman and Rowe Architecture, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Eyes lifted from screens, voices dropped, conversations cut short. I felt the weight of their stares before I even reached the elevator. By the time I set my bag at my desk, an email notification blinked at the corner of my screen. My stomach turned as I clicked. Subject line: integrity of our leadership. The message was anonymous. It accused me of laundering money through Carter Imports, LLC, attaching screenshots of documents identical to the ones pulled from the box last night. It was sent to every employee in the company. My chest tightened, and my palms went clammy as the realization hit me. Everyone had seen it before I even walked in. Olivia Barnes stood near the coffee station, her voice low but sharp enough to carry. I just don't see how this is a coincidence. Her words landed like darts. She had been my colleague for 6 years, ambitious and respected, and now she was watching me like I was a stranger. A younger associate whispered to another, and both turned away when I looked over. The air was thick with speculation. I could almost hear the accusations crawling across the room. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, but the walls seemed to close in. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that my name had been stolen, that my sister had orchestrated this, but none of them would believe me if I said it now. To them, it would sound like excuses. Olivia approached, her expression sharp. Lauren, this is serious. If there's something you need to come clean about, now is the time. Heat flared in my chest. I forced myself to meet her gaze. I have nothing to confess, Olivia. Her lips pressed into a thin line, doubt clear in her eyes before she turned and walked away. I buried my face in my hands, the hum of the office rising like a wave around me. That was when my phone buzzed. A message from Marcy, the assistant, to our managing director. Mr. Cole wants to see you. Now. The walk down the corridor felt endless. I pushed open the door to Michael Cole's office and found him standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He was a man known for calm and precision, but when he turned his eyes on me, I saw something harder. Close the door, Lauren. I obeyed, my legs unsteady. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit. I lowered myself into the seat, every muscle tight. He picked up a folder from his desk and opened it, revealing a printed copy of the same anonymous email. He slid it toward me without a word. I swallowed hard. That is not true. Those documents were planted. Michael leaned forward, his voice measured but firm. Regardless of what you say, perception matters here. This email has reached every corner of the company. The board has already been alerted. They will review the situation, and until then you need to be prepared for scrutiny. My heart pounded. Please, Michael, you know me. You know my work, my integrity. His eyes softened for just a second. I know your record, Lauren, but the company cannot ignore something this public. You need to understand how delicate this is. I gripped the armrests, fighting the tremor in my hands. This is my sister's doing. She is trying to ruin me. Michael exhaled slowly. Family drama or not, this is bigger than that now. I am giving you a warning. Be ready to defend yourself because the board will not wait for personal explanations. The words sank into me like ice water. He was not condemning me, but he was not protecting me either. He closed the folder and straightened. That is all for now. I stood on legs that felt foreign, thanked him in a voice that cracked, and stepped back into the hallway. The whispers rose again as I passed desks, but I forced myself not to look. Back at my seat, I stared at the blank screen of my computer, the cursor blinking like a countdown. Everywhere I turned, there was suspicion, and for the first time, I understood how quickly everything I had built could crumble. The company I loved, the career I had poured myself into, all balanced on the fragile line of my family's name. When the clock struck noon, the chatter of the office grew louder. People filing out for lunch, but I stayed frozen at my desk. My inbox filled with messages, some curt, some cautious. None of them felt like support. The sound of Olivia's laughter with another colleague carried across the room. I pressed my palms flat against the desk, trying to steady myself. The board would be watching me now, measuring every move. Michael's words echoed in my head. Be ready to defend yourself. As the day dragged forward, I knew with a sinking certainty that the shadows of my family had followed me here into the one place I thought I was safe. And soon, there would be nowhere left to hide. The phone rang just after I walked through the door that night, the sound sharp in the silence of the apartment. I dropped my bag on the counter, my body still buzzing from the unease of the office, and glanced at the screen. Samantha. For a moment, I thought of letting it ring out, but something inside me tightened and I swiped to answer. Her voice spilled out syrupy and warm. Lauren, happy belated birthday. I wanted to check on you after the surprise yesterday. Did you like the gift? I froze, the sound of her laugh pulling me back to every holiday table, every smirk across the room. My throat tightened. What do you want, Sam? There was a pause, then her tone shifted sharper beneath the sweetness. I want you to stay quiet. Do not talk to the police. Do not mention my name. If you do, you will regret it. I felt Ethan's presence before I saw him. He stepped from the hallway, his eyes locked on me, sensing the venom in her voice. I turned the phone slightly so he could hear. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, though my chest was pounding. Samantha let out a soft laugh, the kind she used when she thought she had already won. Don't play dumb, Lauren. Carter Imports exists for a reason. You were always the weak one. You can carry the weight while I keep the rewards. Ethan scribbled something on a notepad and slid it toward me. Record her. I nodded almost imperceptibly, fumbling for the setting on my phone and hitting record. Samantha's words dripped through the speaker, her rhythm casual but edged with steel. Do you know what happens to people who cooperate with investigators? They lose everything. Their job, their reputation, their marriage. You would be wise to remember that. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep her talking. Why are you doing this to me? Her laughter came sharp. Because you were always the expendable one. Mom and Dad know it. I know it. You are nothing without this family. You should be grateful I even let your name stand on the paperwork. My knees felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the counter. Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened, his fists clenching at his sides. Then she slipped. You have no idea how hard it is to move $2.3 million through accounts without raising suspicion. That is why your name is on it. You are my shield." The room spun, the number echoing in my head like a hammer blow. Ethan's eyes widened. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my voice trembling. "What did you just say?" Samantha inhaled sharply, as if she realized too late. "Forget it. You heard nothing. Keep your mouth shut, Lauren, or that pretty little life you built in Boston will disappear." The line went dead. I stood frozen, the silence screaming louder than her words. Ethan stepped forward, wrapping his arms around me, grounding me in the chaos. He whispered into my hair. "We got it. She said it." I replayed the recording, the number clear, her voice undeniable. My hands shook as I held the phone between us. Ethan's face hardened. "This is evidence. You need to take this to the police tomorrow." But even as he said it, fear gnawed at me. Samantha was reckless, yes, but she was also clever. She had always been the golden child, the one protected by my parents. I imagined Richard and Diane, their proud faces turned cold if they ever learned I had exposed her. What if they chose her again? What if they backed her no matter what she had done? Ethan tilted my chin until I met his eyes. "They cannot protect her from this. Not anymore." I nodded, but the dread remained lodged in my chest like a stone. I walked to the window, staring out at the glow of Boston streets, wondering how many more shadows from my past were waiting just beyond the glass. The phone sat heavy in my hand, the recording saved. Proof that Samantha had woven me into her scheme. Proof that she would do anything to keep me silent. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, the sound of her voice still echoing in my ears. The game had shifted, and now I held something she could not control. The invitation to dinner came from my mother, in the form of a clipped voicemail, the kind where the words themselves carried no warmth. She said it was important that the family needed to talk. I knew what that meant. It meant Samantha had already spun her version, and Richard and Diane wanted me to sit under their roof and accept it. Ethan offered to come with me, but I shook my head. This was something I had to walk into alone. The drive to Newton felt longer than it was, the trees lining the quiet streets looking like guards, leading me back to the same place where every scar had started. When I stepped into the dining room, the air was heavy with perfume and roast chicken. My father sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared, his face carved in disapproval before I even opened my mouth. My mother poured wine into crystal glasses, not looking at me as she slid one toward Samantha, who was already seated, her smile faint, but victorious. I took my chair, the one I had always been given, a few seats down, far enough away from the spotlight, but close enough to be accused. Richard's fork clinked against his plate. "You've brought shame to this family, Lauren. First your career is in question, and now this business with the police." I clenched my jaw. "I am not the one who started this." Diane finally looked at me, her eyes cold. "Always with excuses. You are 34, no children, no legacy, nothing to show but trouble. Samantha has been carrying this family while you play at independence." The words sliced deeper than I wanted to admit, but I held her gaze. Ethan's voice echoed in my head, steady and grounding. "Do not let them break you." Samantha tilted her head, feigning hurt. "I never wanted this, Lauren. I only wanted us to be close again. But the choices you made, they are catching up with you." I laughed, the sound bitter. "My choices? You mean your schemes?" Her smile flickered, then she reached into her bag and laid a glossy photograph on the table. The picture showed me mid-stride on a sidewalk, a Carter Imports sign looming large in the background. "See?" Samantha said softly, sliding it toward Richard and Diane. "She has been there. She knows." My father's eyes narrowed as he studied the photo. So it is true. My heart pounded, fury burning through the fear. That picture is nothing. I walked past a building one afternoon, and now it is evidence. How convenient, Samantha. You were always good at arranging appearances. My mother's lips curled. Always deflecting, always blaming others. I slammed my hand on the table, the glasses rattling. "I am done being your scapegoat. You sit here pretending to be blind while Samantha uses me as a shield. Do you even care what she admitted to me on the phone? She said the number $2.3 million. She slipped. Samantha's face paled for just a second before she forced another look of innocence. "You are twisting everything." Richard's voice rose sharp and booming. "Enough. Do not bring your delusions into this house." I looked at him, the man who had never defended me, and I felt the years of silence collapse into rage. "You can keep protecting her, but I will not stay quiet. Not anymore." The room stilled, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Samantha leaned back, her fingers tightening around her glass. Diane shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between us, as if the walls she had built were finally starting to crack. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping the floor. "If you think I am walking out of here with my head down, you are wrong." And with that, I turned toward the door, the photograph left on the table behind me. The false proof of a story I refused to let them write. I drove back to Boston with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my chest still burning with the sting of their words. The photo, the accusations, the way Samantha's voice had dripped with false innocence. It all churned in my head until I felt dizzy. Ethan was waiting when I walked in, and I collapsed into his arms before I could say a word. He listened quietly as I told him everything, every detail of the dinner table, every insult, every lie. By morning, I had an appointment downtown with a federal attorney named Mark Johnson. His office was quiet, lined with books and framed certificates. He looked at me with calm, steady eyes, the kind of gaze that said he had seen families implode before. He asked me to play the recording of Samantha's call, and he listened without interruption, only nodding when her voice slipped and the number spilled out. He folded his hands together on the desk. "This is important, Lauren. You need to hold on to this recording. Keep it safe. Do not share it with anyone except law enforcement. It may be the strongest piece of evidence you have." I nodded, my fingers cold around the phone. I wanted to believe that was enough, but his tone told me it wasn't. Later that afternoon, 2 FBI agents met me in a conference room at their Boston field office. The fluorescent lights hummed above us as I slid a folder across the table, the documents pulled from the birthday box. They examined them closely, their gloved hands turning over each page. One of them glanced up at me and asked if the signatures were mine. I leaned forward. "They look like mine, but I never signed these." They exchanged a look, then placed the pages into an evidence bag. Their forensic unit would confirm, but both of them seemed certain already. Forgery. For a moment, relief flickered in me like a flame in the dark. But it didn't last. One of the agents pulled up a file on the laptop and turned the screen toward me. "Do you recognize this account?" On the screen was a bank statement, the name Lauren Mitchell, printed neatly at the top. My stomach dropped as I scanned the numbers. A balance of $78,000 with deposits spread across months I barely remembered. "That is not my account. I have never opened this." The agent's face remained unreadable. "It was opened 3 years ago in your name with your social security number. The deposits match transfers we are investigating in connection with Carter Imports." I felt my breath catch. 78,000. To them, it was evidence. To me, it was a trap. Mark Johnson, who had joined the meeting, leaned slightly toward me. "We will work through this, Lauren. The key is to stay consistent. Do not panic. The truth has a way of surfacing, but we have to be patient." But patience was not easy with the weight of suspicion pressing down on me. I thought of my colleagues, the way whispers had already spread through the office. I thought of Olivia's eyes narrowing when I walked past her desk. If this leaked, if the board believed it, my career would be finished. I pressed my palms flat on the table, trying to steady myself. Samantha did this. She put my name on everything so she could keep her own hands clean. One of the agents asked about my relationship with my sister, his tone careful, as if measuring every word. I told him about the favoritism, the history, the way she had always been the golden child. I told him about the call, about the threats, about the $2.3 million she had admitted. They wrote everything down. When I walked out of the building, the air felt sharper, colder, as though the city itself had turned against me. Ethan was waiting on the sidewalk, his face tense as he searched mine. "They found a bank account," I whispered. "In my name." His jaw clenched. "Of course they did. It is her move, but it does not mean she wins. The words steadied me for a moment, but the fear still sat heavy in my chest. It was not just about family anymore. It was about the law, about the government, about proof I didn't have, and lies I couldn't seem to outrun. That night I lay awake listening to the city outside my window, every siren sounding like a warning. Somewhere in the shadows, Samantha was waiting, tightening the net around me, and all I could do was hold on to the recording, the one piece of truth I had, and pray it would be enough. The next morning I walked into the office in Cambridge with my head held high, but the shift in the air was undeniable. Conversations hushed when I stepped off the elevator, eyes flicked toward me, and then away, as if contact might taint them. The rumor had spread faster than I thought possible, faster even than the investigation itself. My inbox was filled with polite but distant notes from coworkers who had once been warm, now choosing formality over friendship. At the coffee machine, Olivia Barnes stood with her arms folded, watching the drip with more intensity than it deserved. When I greeted her, she offered a faint smile that carried no weight. She asked how I was holding up, but her tone was clipped, and her eyes lingered too long on the badge clipped to my jacket, as if it might tell her whether I was guilty. I wanted to tell her everything: the forged documents, the bank account, the recording of Samantha's voice. But I held back. To her, to all of them, I was under suspicion, and nothing I said would undo that until the truth surfaced through official channels. By mid-afternoon, I was drowning in the silence. The open office that once buzzed with chatter now felt like a courtroom where every whisper was a verdict. My work piled up untouched as I replayed the FBI's questions in my head. The more I sat there, the more I wondered if my presence made them uneasy, as though my proximity alone could drag them into scandal. When I finally packed my bag and left the gray Boston sky, pressed low and heavy, I made it to the lobby of my building when the security guard called my name. "There is something for you." On the counter sat a tall arrangement of lilies and roses, their fragrance thick and cloying. A small white envelope was tucked into the stems. My name was written on the front in neat, deliberate strokes. I opened it with trembling fingers. "I am always watching you." The words were simple, but the way the letters curved and the ink pressed deep into the card made my chest tighten. It was familiar, eerily, so as if I had seen that handwriting before. I studied it until the memory clicked. 3 years ago, a junior analyst named Kevin Doyle had been fired for mishandling company funds. He had been close to Samantha, always hanging on her words during the few times she visited the office. His resignation letter had carried the same slanted script, the same heavy pressure on the loops. My throat dried. Was he still loyal to her? Was he the one who opened the fake account, who placed the flowers here like a threat wrapped in beauty? I tucked the card back into the envelope and forced a smile at the guard. "Thank you." Upstairs, Ethan examined the card with a frown. "This is not random. Someone wants you rattled." "It is her," I whispered. "Or someone she has working for her." We sat in silence for a long time, the flowers looming on the table between us like an intruder we could not evict. My phone buzzed with a new email, one from Olivia, short and sharp. "The board is asking questions. Be prepared." I shut the laptop, my pulse racing. It was no longer just Samantha against me. It was Samantha, the system, and anyone she could draw into her orbit. The net was tightening, and now it had faces I could not even see. That night, as the city lights flickered through the blinds, I thought of the handwriting again, of Kevin's smirk, the day he left the company, of the way Samantha had always found people willing to carry out her dirt. The flowers were not a gift. They were a warning. And if she had allies outside the family, then the battle ahead was larger than I had ever imagined. The morning headlines pulled me out of a restless sleep. A local business journal had splashed across its front page the story of several entrepreneurs swindled by a shell company called Carter Imports. Their faces were blurred, but their losses were not. Tens of thousands of dollars gone, siphoned through promises of luxury shipments that never arrived. Reading it, my stomach knotted. My name had been tied to this company, my signature forged to anchor its credibility, and now lives beyond mine were being wrecked. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my eyes. The guilt wasn't logical. but it was crushing all the same. Ethan placed a cup of coffee in front of me and rested his hand on my shoulder. "It is not your fault, Lauren. They used you." Before I could answer, the buzzer rang downstairs. Ethan went to check, and a few moments later, he returned with a man in his early 40s, dressed in a navy blazer that did little to hide the weariness carved into his face. He introduced himself as David Thompson. "I read about your situation," he said, setting a folder on the table. "I needed to find you." The folder was filled with invoices, emails, and bank statements. The numbers screamed off the page. $80,000 wired gone without a trace. "I was building a new retail line," he explained. "Samantha approached me through Carter Imports, promised me access to suppliers in Europe. She was convincing. She said she had the family backing that nothing could go wrong." My chest tightened. "She said those exact words?" "Yes," he nodded. "She bragged about her father being untouchable, about her mother smoothing over anything she did. She told me as long as the Carters stood behind her, no one would dare push back." I felt the room tilt. It was no longer whispers, no longer me against shadows. Here was a living victim, proof that Samantha's schemes were spreading like wildfire. Ethan leaned forward. "Why come to us? Why not the police?" David's mouth twisted. "I tried." They shrugged. "Said it was a civil matter. But when your name came up in the news, I realized she must have dragged you into this too. If we work together, maybe they will listen." I stared at the papers again, the false contracts stamped with Carter Imports logos, the signatures that mimicked professionalism but reeked of fraud. My voice came out sharper than I intended. "She used my identity to cover her trail, and she used your money to fuel it." David's eyes softened. "Then we are both her casualties." The word clung to the air. Casualties. That was what Samantha left behind, not sisters or partners or family, but bodies in the wreckage of her ambition. I promised David I would connect him with Agent Mark Johnson, that his testimony could widen the case. He gripped my hand firmly, gratitude flickering through his exhaustion. "I cannot let her destroy anyone else," he said. After he left, I sank into the couch, staring at the folder that now felt heavier than stone. Ethan poured more coffee, but I barely touched it. I thought of every dinner where Samantha had been praised, every holiday where she had been draped in compliments, while I was measured against impossible standards. And now, here was the result. A woman shielded by her parents' blind pride, preying on people who trusted her smile. The city outside moved on, as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. It was no longer about clearing my name. It was about stopping her before more families lost everything. That evening, I placed the folder beside the recording of Samantha's phone call and the forged bank documents already tucked in my file. Each piece was another brick in the case, another chance at finally dismantling the lie she had built around us. Yet beneath the resolve, there was fear. If she had fooled so many, if she had people like Kevin working for her, then how deep did her reach go? And when the truth came out, how far would she go to keep herself safe? The question lingered as I turned off the light, David's weary face etched into my memory. Samantha had made me her shield, but now I had witnesses, proof, and allies. And with them came a new resolve that this battle was just beginning. Mark called early, his voice steady, while mine wavered. He said my parents had been scheduled for interviews at the federal building on Causeway Street, and that I should be available by phone in case agents needed clarification. I told him I would be there in person. Ethan tried to convince me to stay home to let the process play out, but sitting on a couch while my family tried to rewrite my life felt unbearable. We drove in silence, the hum of traffic louder than any words I could find. The lobby smelled of coffee and cold marble. Mark met us near security, nodded once, and led us to a small waiting area outside a bank of interview rooms. Through frosted glass, I could see blurred shapes, moving agents in suits, a clerk with a stack of files. My stomach knotted when the elevator opened and my parents stepped out together, as if arriving for a concert instead of an interrogation. Richard wore a navy blazer, and that expression he saved for moments when he planned to win by sheer force of personality. Diane clutched a manila folder to her chest and kept her eyes on the floor until she spotted me. She stiffened, then recovered with a thin smile. Richard did not bother. His gaze slid over me and landed on Mark, with the kind of measured distrust he used on opposing counsel back when he practiced law. An agent introduced himself and escorted them past me. I caught a whiff of my mother's perfume, and it sent me straight back to childhood Sundays, when I sat quietly in the back seat while Samantha chattered about her next triumph. Mark took the chair beside me. "Stay calm," he said, his tone even. "This is where consistency matters. If they lie or contradict themselves, the agents will catch it." I clasped my hands to stop the trembling. "Do you think Samantha prepared them?" "I think Samantha prepares everyone," he said. Time inched forward. I stared at the closed door and thought of David Thompson's folder on my kitchen table of the anonymous bank account, with my name typed neatly across the top of the way Samantha had said the number without a hint of regret. 2.3 million. The fluorescent lighting hummed, and Ethan rubbed slow circles between my shoulders. Raised voices cut through the hallway. Richard's cadence carried first clipped and confident, the sound of a man insisting on a narrative. Diane's voice followed a higher thread that wavered in and out of control. A moment later, the door opened, and an agent stepped out to ask me a simple question. "Did you ever grant power of attorney to your sister?" I said no. He nodded, thanked me, and disappeared again. When at last my parents emerged, their faces told two different stories. Richard wore the tight smile of someone who believes he has neutralized a threat. Diane looked smaller, as if part of her had collapsed inward. She avoided my eyes until Richard spoke. "This is your mess," he said. "You dragged us here so you could play the victim in front of strangers." A heat rose in my chest, but I kept my voice even. "You are here because Samantha used our name to hurt people." He snorted. "Our name is not on trial. Your choices are." Mark stepped forward, a quiet barrier between us. "Mr. Carter. Mrs. Carter, agents may have additional questions. Please remain available." Diane flinched a little at Mark's formality. Then she turned to me, her voice too soft for the hallway. "You never could handle responsibility, Lauren. First the office, now this. Why can you not make things simple?" "I was the one who wanted simple," I said. "Samantha made this complicated when she put my name on her company." For a breath I thought Diane might spit back the usual line, that I misunderstood, that I was jealous that Samantha was saving the family from embarrassment I caused. Instead, she glanced down at the manila folder and her fingers tightened around its edge. The skin at her knuckles went white. The agents returned with a new request. "Mrs. Carter, did you recently sign any documents on behalf of Samantha Carter or Carter Imports? Routine forms a line of credit, perhaps?" Diane's eyes flicked to Richard. He gave her a look that said, "Be careful and say nothing unnecessary." She swallowed the movement visible in her throat. "I only helped with something small," she said, the words tumbling out. "Samantha said it was a short-term loan application, a bridge until new partners came through. She told me it was harmless, just a signature to show a family guarantor. I did not read all the pages. I trusted my own daughter." The hallway seemed to tilt. Mark's posture sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Which documents did you sign?" he asked gently. Diane faltered. "Anne." "It was electronic. She sent a link, told me to click through. There were boxes. I saw her name and mine in a small line. I thought it was just a confirmation. She said it would never be used." An agent lifted his pen. "Mrs. Carter, did you understand the amount associated with that loan?" She blinked, genuinely confused. "A small amount," she said, and her voice quivered. 20,000, maybe 30? She promised it would be repaid within weeks." The agent exchanged a glance with his colleague. He thanked her and noted they would need access to her email and the device she used. Richard bristled. "You cannot seize private property without process." The agent remained steady. "We will obtain the necessary orders." My mother looked as if the floor had given way beneath her. She finally met my eyes, and in that instant, all the rehearsed defenses slid off her face. She had believed Samantha. She had signed because she wanted to believe that loyalty could fix what it had never fixed before. Mark spoke softly to the agents about subpoenas for DocuSign records and IP logs. He mentioned metadata and audit trails, and the fact that my name had been used without my consent. He sounded like a man lining up dominoes. Richard rounded on me again. If you had shown better judgment in your own life, Samantha would not have felt she had to take drastic measures. This family has sacrificed for you, and you repay us by dragging federal agents into our home. I took a breath and pictured the women I had become close to at work, the ones who had told me in quiet moments that setting boundaries felt like treason when your parents trained you to comply. I lifted my chin. Samantha used me to shield herself. She used Mom to legitimize it. She used our name to defraud people like David Thompson. That is not sacrifice. That is manipulation. Diane's lips trembled. David who? A victim, I said. A man who believed her when she bragged that the Carters would protect her no matter what she did. For the first time, I saw something like recognition cross my mother's face. Not agreement, not yet, but a crack in the wall. She looked at Richard as if trying to find the right script, and finding none that fit. Mark placed a hand on my elbow, a quiet cue to step back. He thanked my parents for coming and reminded them that agents would follow up. Richard muttered something about rights and reputations and marched toward the elevator. Diane lingered. She leaned closer, her words so faint, I almost missed them. I only meant to help her, she said. I did not know. Then she turned and followed my father, her shoulders hunched against a weight I recognized all too well. We stood in the silence that followed. Mark exhaled slowly. That was significant, he said. If we can tie her signature to transfers that intersect with your forged documents, it supports a pattern of deception. It also suggests your mother was misled, which shifts focus where it belongs. I nodded, a dull ache spreading beneath my ribs. I wanted to feel triumphant, but all I felt was tired. The shape of Samantha's lies was finely visible, and it looked like a trap she had built from the people who loved her most. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from my face. Let's get some air. Outside, the wind off the Charles cut clean and cold, and the sky over the Zakim Bridge had turned the color of steel. Cars roared past, while a gull wheeled high above, indifferent to our small disaster. We crossed to a bench and sat the sounds of the city, a muffled backdrop. I told Ethan about the way my mother's voice had thinned when she said small loan, how her hands had shaken when she realized agents would read every click she made. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took my hand and pressed it to his chest. This helps you, he said. It shows you were not alone in being used. I wanted to believe him, and for a moment I did. The path ahead was still a maze of hearings and statements and long nights with paperwork, but at least one piece had shifted into place. My mother was not the architect of this. She was another thread Samantha had pulled until the fabric tore. Mark called as we walked back to the car. He said the agents would move quickly on the subpoenas and that I should be ready for follow-up questions about the anonymous bank account. He sounded measured, almost optimistic. I thanked him and promised to keep my phone close. In the passenger seat, I watched the river slide by, dark and steady. My reflection in the window looked older than it had a week ago. I thought of the evening at my parents' table when Samantha had laid down that glossy photograph and dared me to argue with an image. Today, I had watched a different kind of picture come into focus, not a staged snapshot, but a sequence of choices and signatures and lies. We drove in silence for a while. When the first street lights flickered on, I let my head rest against the seat and closed my eyes, not to escape, but to gather myself for what would come next. The courthouse loomed ahead with its granite columns and high steps that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and each one I climbed felt like another layer of the past weighing on me. The corridors inside were filled with a hushed tension, attorneys whispering, journalists scribbling notes, the smell of paper and coffee thick in the air. Ethan's hand pressed gently against my back, as if to remind me I wasn't walking into this storm alone. When the bailiff called the room to order, the silence became heavy, almost unbearable. Samantha sat at the defense table in a crisp suit far too polished for the wreckage she had left behind. Her eyes flicked to me once, and then darted away, the corners twitching in a nervous attempt at control. Richard and Diane sat behind her, their posture rigid, hands clasped as if in prayer, but their eyes told another story. They were not here for me. They were not even here for justice. They were here for themselves. The federal prosecutor laid out the case in measured words that landed like stones in a still pond. Fraud, forgery, money laundering. The name Carter Imports LLC echoed in the room like a curse. Screens lit up with financial record signatures compared side by side, the fake against the real, and every arrow pointed to Samantha. I sat still, my heart beating against my ribs, as the prosecutor clicked through slide after slide, every number another nail in the coffin Samantha had built with her own hands. When it was my turn to testify, the room shifted, all eyes on me. I told the court about the package, about the false documents in my name, about the phone call where Samantha let the word slip. The recording was played, her voice trembling on the speakers, and I could see her facade crack, just a hairline fracture. But enough. I spoke about the birthday, about Ethan's warning, about how quickly joy had turned to suspicion. My voice held steadier than I expected, and when I stepped down, the judge gave a brief nod, a gesture so small, yet it felt monumental. Then Richard was called. He looked older under the fluorescent lights, his hands trembling as he swore the oath. At first he tried to weave excuses, but under cross-examination he admitted he had seen Samantha handling documents he did not fully understand. He said he thought they were small business loans, nothing more. Diane followed, her voice softer, almost apologetic, as she admitted signing papers for Samantha, believing they were harmless forms to help her daughter get established. With every word, they distanced themselves from her, choosing survival over loyalty. Samantha's face changed then. She tried to hold it together, but when her own attorney pressed for an explanation, she broke, her voice rising in desperation. She turned in her seat, eyes wide, begging Richard and Diane to stand with her. She pleaded, voice cracking, her hands trembling as she reached toward them. But Richard sat stone-faced. Diane lowered her gaze, and not a word of comfort passed their lips. The courtroom grew still as her cries filled the air, her carefully built mask dissolving into raw panic. She dropped to her knees beside the defense table, clutching at her parents' silence like it might somehow transform if she begged hard enough. But nothing came. They would not save her. They could not. The judge called for order, the gavel striking hard. The prosecutor's voice cut through the chaos, reminding the court of the charges at hand, the evidence undeniable. Samantha was lifted by marshals, her tears streaking her face as she was seated again. I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache where family should have been. When the recess was called, the room slowly emptied, murmurs echoing off the marble walls. I stayed seated, staring at the spot where Samantha had knelt, where she had looked so small, so powerless. Not because she lacked strength, but because every lie she spun had finally tangled into a net she could not escape. I rose slowly, Ethan steady at my side, and as we walked toward the hall, I felt the strange weight of both loss and liberation pressing on me. The trial was far from over, but the mask had been shattered in front of everyone, and there was no way back for her now. The courtroom buzzed with restless murmurs as the judge returned, his voice steady as he delivered the verdict. Samantha was found guilty on all charges, her sentence laid out in stark terms. She would face 7 years of federal probation, barred from any business ventures, fined heavily, and marked by the weight of a conviction that would never leave her name. The sound of the gavel struck hard, final, and in that moment, it felt as though the last thread holding our family together had snapped. Richard and Diane sat stiffly, their faces pale, as though the world had shifted beneath them. They had managed to keep their freedom, yet the cost was written on their expressions. Their names were forever tied to a scandal, their reputation in Boston circles fractured beyond repair. The neighbors who once admired them would whisper behind closed doors, and the clubs and committees they cherished would quietly distance themselves. Samantha was led out by marshals, her shoulders slumped, her eyes avoiding the crowd. For all her bravado, she looked like a shell of the sister I once knew, stripped of power and stripped of the parents' protection she had always relied on. I should have felt relief, but the ache was sharp, a wound layered over years of betrayal. In the days that followed, newspapers ran headlines dissecting the fall of the Carter family. Victims came forward their stories of lost savings and shattered trust, filling columns with details of deceit. One by one, lawsuits stacked against Samantha, and though the federal charges sealed her fate, the civil cases ensured she would never escape the debts she owed. David Thompson called me once to say thank you, his voice firm with the satisfaction of justice finally served. He had lost more than money, he said, but now at least the truth was public. At work, the tension shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. Conversation still quieted when I walked into the break room, but the looks of suspicion began to dull. Olivia Barnes remained distant at first, her gaze cool but less sharp than before. She kept her distance during meetings, her words clipped, yet I noticed her watching me with something different in her eyes. It was during a project review that she finally spoke. The conference room was filled with chatter numbers flashing on the screen when she cleared her throat and said softly that fairness should extend to everyone, including those unfairly accused. Her words hung in the air, not directed at me yet, landing with precision. Heads turned, and I caught the flicker of understanding pass through the team. Later that evening, Olivia stopped me in the hallway. She hesitated before speaking, her voice measured but sincere. She admitted she had doubted me, that the evidence against me had seemed too convincing. But now she knew better, and she wanted me to know she had spoken with the board about reconsidering my stalled promotion. She was not promising me anything, she said, but she believed I deserved a fair chance. The shift in her tone was subtle, but it carried a weight I had not expected. For months I had lived under suspicion, my every move shadowed by doubt, and to hear even a sliver of support from someone who had once stood firmly against me felt like light breaking through clouded skies. At home, Ethan wrapped me in quiet reassurance, reminding me that truth had prevailed, even if scars remained. I found myself standing by the window at night, looking out over the Boston skyline, the city lights blinking like distant stars. The path forward would not be easy. My parents had chosen silence over love. My sister had chosen greed over family, and the fragments left behind were sharp. Still, there was movement in the right direction. The whispers at work softened, the board called for a meeting to review my record, and Olivia's voice in that room carried a conviction I could never have forced. It was not forgiveness, not friendship, but it was respect. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the ground beneath me steady. The echoes of the trial lingered, the sound of Samantha's pleas haunting in their desperation. The image of my parents turning away from her burned into my memory. But alongside the grief, there was clarity. Justice had drawn its lines, and though the losses were heavy, the truth stood firm. One evening as I locked up my office, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass door. I looked tired, older somehow, yet there was something new in my expression. Strength. I had endured the storm, and though I carried the marks of it, I was still standing. The world had shifted, the pieces rearranged, and as I stepped out into the cool air of the city, I knew this chapter was closing. The battle had been brutal, the wounds deep, but the lies had been stripped bare. The night air wrapped around me as I walked toward Ethan's car, waiting at the curb, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe without the weight of accusation pressing on my chest. What came next was unknown, but the foundation beneath me was mine again, rebuilt on truth, and I would not let it be taken from me. The quiet of our Boston apartment greeted me as I pushed the door open, the familiar scent of home washing over me, after weeks spent under fluorescent courthouse lights and the heavy air of confrontation. I set my bag on the counter and paused, my eyes falling on the corner of the living room where the box still sat. It had been emptied long ago, its false contents taken as evidence, but I had kept the shell. The cardboard was worn, its edges frayed, yet it stood as a reminder of the night everything changed. I walked toward it slowly, as though approaching something alive, my hand brushing the surface, before I sank down onto the couch. That box was meant to break me, to shatter my reputation, and bind me to a crime I never committed. Instead, it had become the catalyst for unraveling the lies that had chained me for years. My sister's cruelty had been the spark, but it was my parents' silence that cut the deepest. Their choice to let me stand alone had finally stripped me of the illusion that blood alone defined family. Ethan came in quietly, setting his keys on the counter, his gaze following mine. He sat beside me, without speaking, his hand covering mine. In that silence, I felt the weight of everything we had survived together. He had been my anchor when doubt threatened to drown me, the one who noticed the smallest details, who trusted my truth, even when others turned away. Without him, I might have believed the lies. With him, I had found the strength to fight back. I leaned into his shoulder, watching the Boston skyline flicker beyond the window. The city felt different now, no longer a place where I walked in the shadow of my family's name, but a place where I could carve my own path. The trial had ended, but the scars it left were etched deep. My sister's pleading face, my parents' cold retreat, Olivia's careful words at work, all played in my mind like fragments of a story I once belonged to, but no longer owned. The following week, the board at my firm called me in. The room was filled with the same faces that had once eyed me with suspicion. This time, the air was different. They spoke of my record, my work ethic, and the way I had handled myself under pressure. Olivia's voice carried weight, her steady insistence that I deserved fairness, pushing the conversation forward. When the meeting ended, they told me my promotion was reinstated. I left the building with tears I hadn't realized I was holding back, not because of the title, but because I had reclaimed the dignity they tried to strip from me. That night, Ethan and I walked along the Charles River, the cool air crisp against my skin. I told him I was done chasing approval that was never mine to earn. My parents had chosen their side, Samantha had chosen hers, and I was choosing mine. I wanted to build something different, something rooted not in obligation, but in respect and love. In the months that followed, I began putting pieces of myself back together. I joined a nonprofit that supported women navigating financial fraud, offering my story as proof that survival was possible. I reached out to David Thompson, and together we worked on advocacy for victims of white-collar crime. Slowly, I found myself surrounded by people who valued truth over pretense, who saw me not as a pawn in my family's games, but as a person who had stood her ground. One evening, as autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalks, I returned home to find Ethan setting the table for two. On my plate was a small ribboned box. Nothing elaborate, just a simple gesture. My chest tightened for a moment, a flicker of memory flashing back to the night of my birthday. But when I opened it, I found a silver keychain shaped like a compass. Ethan smiled, telling me it was to remind me that no matter how lost I felt, I had the strength to find my own direction. I held it in my hand, the cool metal warming against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt the past loosen its grip. That box no longer defined me. The lies my sister spun, the silence of my parents, the years of being told I was a failure, all of it had led me here to a place where I was free to choose what came next. I stood by the window again, looking at the city lights stretching out like threads of possibility. My voice was quiet but steady, as I said aloud the truth I had finally embraced. I used to believe that family was a bond that could never be broken, that no matter what blood would keep us tied together. But I learned that family is not always the place we are born into. Sometimes it is the people who walk beside us when the world turns away, the ones who remind us of our worth, when everything else is stripped bare. And as I looked at Ethan, at the life we were building, I knew I had chosen my family. Not the one that betrayed me, but the one that believed in me, fought for me, and stood by me. So if you are listening to my story, wondering what it means to lose everything you thought you knew, let this be your reminder. Sometimes family is not where we come from, but where we find recognition and kindness. Sometimes freedom is not leaving the past behind, but choosing to no longer let it define you. And maybe like me, you will find that in the end, the life you rebuild is stronger because it is yours.